The Airline Business Podcast is sponsored by Panasonic Avionics. Hello and welcome to the Airline Business Podcast, discussing key news and trends in the global airline sector. This time, we're only a month into the year, but is the industry already having to rethink its aspirations on safety, production and consolidation? My name's Dunn, Executive Editor at FlightGlobal, and joining me as ever is Airline Business Editor Lewis Harper.
Hi Graham, how are you?
Yes, good, not too bad at all. How are you doing?
I'm not too bad, thank you. Yeah, an interesting start to the year so far. We thought it might be a quiet January, but I think it's fair to say it's been anything but so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We quite often do kind of forecast style pieces, or it's quite difficult to do forecast pieces, but they sort of wrap up the challenges of the year ahead. And, within a week, so many other things were kind of on the agenda, especially for Boeing.
Well, exactly, yeah. So where to start? I mean, with Boeing, the 737 MAX program was, not in the best state, both sort of over the longer and sort of nearer term. There are challenges there around ramping up production, not unique to Boeing, of course. There are supply chain issues across the economy, also affecting Airbus. But of course, the incident with the Alaska Airlines MAX 9 a few days into the year, it sort of brought the microscope onto that program again. I think in terms of the impact of that incident, obviously, on airlines, the MAX 9 is not anywhere near as popular a variant as the 8 in terms of how many are in service. So it very much affected, United, Alaska, a few other carriers in a significant way. But this wasn't, like the grounding of the kind of flagship of the family. So, and most of those are back in the air now. So while that has created some short-term challenges for airlines, it kind of hopefully through the worst of that now. But, what this means for Boeing and the wider MAX program is probably, more delays and more challenges, getting the aircraft out of the factory.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we saw as part of this, and, not surprising given everything that Boeing has been through over the last a couple of years, that the FAA introduced this additional level of oversight, and they've introduced this sort of cap on hiking production whilst it's kind of investigating the cause and so forth, which Boeing is, it's at 38 Boeing Maxes that's producing a month, has an ambition to get up to 50 a month as part of that ramp up with the next couple of years or so. It's sort of too early to tell what kind of impact. We don't know how long a freeze or a hike would remain in place, but a freeze on hiking the production. But what it does illustrate is the added scrutiny, and that just makes people in the industry who are already facing aircraft production problems and supply problems. It just gives them another reason to be a little bit nervous and I guess a bit resigned to aircraft taking longer to get out of the factories and arrive in the fleets.
Yeah, I mean, several airline CEOs are kind of like sounding like stuck records on concerns about Boeing. I mean, it's fair to say that broadly most have come out, supportive of the MAX program and believe that Boeing can turn it around. But, it's only just as they're getting better news on the MAX 9, there's another issue with misdrilled holes on some of the MAX aircraft, which means, more delays for aircraft that are due to come this year. So, a bit more misery for airlines in terms of getting hold of those newer generation aircraft with the sustainability savings they bring, and, means extending the leases on older aircraft types, et cetera. It just means that the industry is, adding to this capacity pressure. So it kind of never ends for Boeing. It feels like, and of course part of that is maybe some of these stories, that like the most recent development wouldn't have been such a huge story in isolation, but when you pile it on top of everything else that's going on, it really does add to the sense that this is an incredibly challenging time. And of course, on top of that, the new scrutiny means that there are concerns that the MAX variants that aren't flying yet, or at least aren't in the hands of commercial airlines yet, it's going to take longer to get those, the MAX 7 and the MAX 10 into airlines' hands as a result of this. And, that's prompted quite strongly worded statements from United Airlines, for example, saying it was taking the MAX 10 out of its fleet plan. It's not cancelling the order, but certainly isn't banking on getting them within the time frame that I think it might have been contractually signed up to. Southwest taking the MAX 7 out of its fleet plan because of concerns about this. So, in an already capacity constrained environment, these challenges for Boeing are just adding to it. And yeah, the MAX program carries on. I mean, there's a lot of them flying. They're doing a decent job for a lot of airlines. But actually getting hold of them and expanding from Boeing's point of view and the airline's point of view, getting hold of the smallest aircraft in the range and the largest is, I think, just been pushed a bit further out potentially. So not fun from that point of view, and a worsening challenge for the industry, certainly in the near future. And of course, the MAX 9 incident came a couple of days after there'd been an incident involving a Japan Airlines jet as well.
Yes, and this brings safety right back to the agenda, which is something which, the industry has done a huge amount to improve over the years, and the levels of safety compared to, historical levels are very impressive for commercial air transport. They've always remained challenges. And, I think probably the thing about this incident, which of course the Japan Airlines A350, was really how visible it was. This is after many years of, relatively little flying in the pandemic. This is probably the first time we've seen those kind of scenes of commercial airline on fire on TV screens around the world, which, coming in, about a day into the new year is a timely reminder. And obviously the amazing and impressive the speed at which the evacuation took place from there. But, an absolute reminder of how it remains a key issue for the industry.
Yeah, it's worth noting that certainly Flight International our sister publication had their annual safety survey out a couple of weeks ago, and 2023 had been one of the safest since records began. Really, it's on the one hand, it's as you say, it's pretty shocking seeing an A350 on fire on the runway, and in many ways, I think it is partly because it's such a rare sight. I mean, in 2023, I think the survey recorded 6 fatal incidents with commercial airliners. No jets involved in any of them, so fatality-free year for commercial jet travel, which is pretty noteworthy. The biggest aircraft involved in a fatal accident was an ATR 72 belonging to Yeti Airlines. So the other aircraft, were much smaller, more commuter types. So 6 fatal accidents, 115 onboard deaths. That was down from 12 fatal accidents, 229 deaths in 2022. And if you look back to 1999, for example, it's 48 fatal accidents and 730 onboard deaths. So, given the thousands of flights a day that the commercial airline industry sees, it's quite a remarkable safety record. But, it always gets these reminders that it needs to, really be focused on this all the time. And, we're waiting for the full report from what happened with the JAL aircraft, clearly. But, it is quite remarkable that, seeing the footage and there being no fatalities from that. Certainly on the JAL aircraft, obviously the Dash 8, is a different story. But yeah, an inauspicious start and obviously some lessons there.
And then on top of that, you also had, one of the big things, particularly in terms of the airline sector, we've talked about a great deal is around consolidation. And, we talked a little bit about it would be intriguing to see what the European and US regulatory perspective on it was, whether those sort of consolidation plans would be allowed to go ahead in the manner in which the airlines wanted. And again, very early into the year, we've already seen with a series of cases that it looks like it is going to be quite difficult to get it across. The most obvious example being the US ruling on JetBlue's attempt to buy Spirit Airlines.
Exactly, yeah. I think we sort of framed it. The first half of January was kind of inauspicious start for safety, and then the second half it was an inauspicious start for consolidation as far as 2024 is concerned. As you say, there was a feeling that regulators were going to come down harder. I mean, they sort of said as much, really, certainly in the USA and Europe. And obviously, we had the court ruling on on JetBlue and Spirit, rejecting that merger. We know in the last few days their appeal has been set for June, and I think that's slightly problematic for them, because I think their deal expires in July, and I think their concern is that they won't get a ruling on that appeal until after their deal has expired. So yes, not a great start for that. Obviously, that was all mainly on competition grounds. So, the court's concern was taking an ultra low cost player out of the market. Obviously, JetBlue's plans for Spirit were to kind of integrate its fleet into its own business model there. But then, spreading to Europe, fairly similar story really. Not outright rejections yet, but in the case of Lufthansa and ITA, and IAG with Air Europa, in both cases, the European Commission has launched in-depth investigations into them, while making some pretty negative noises about what it feels about competitive impact of those two deals. Notably, in Lufthansa's case, it was slightly delayed in submitting the details of the proposed stake in ITA, but partly because it was working on remedies that the European Commission did not even test with the relevant airlines. It kind of just wasn't convinced by them and has gone to the in-depth investigation stage. So, it doesn't mean it's the end of either of those deals by any stretch, but clearly, we are at a point where, if one or both of those deals don't get over the line, or if the remedies that are required are so draconian that they've actually become unattractive, it's sort of, moving the industry in maybe into a slightly different era. We thought that post-COVID would be the time for consolidation, but maybe didn't think much as we should have about whether it would actually be possible.
Yeah, the aspirations to achieve it are definitely there. At what price, at what cost, how much are airlines prepared to give up in order to get these deals over the line remains to be seen. Over a period of time, I'm sure that a fresh balance will emerge, but that could take some time. And IAG's been trying to come up with a workable deal for Air Europa for a consistent period of time, and finds itself, not quite back to square one, but again, sort of not necessarily that much further ahead. So, that is a challenge. And I think you see it even with the European Commission, has just put something out about, very watchful about JetBlue itself as a new entrant rather than in connection to their Spirit Airlines deal, but JetBlue operating into Amsterdam, which they launched that flight last summer, but there was, amid sort of some of the tighter capacity constraints at Amsterdam, it wasn't clear that JetBlue would get the necessary slots to continue operating that flight from New York and from Boston. And, almost a reminder that the European Commission is taking a big priority in terms of making sure that competition exists on those routes. So, this dates back to their previous kind of probes, investigations of the last decade, looking into the role of the big transatlantic joint ventures, which are all kind of based around the global alliances. In that particular case, Amsterdam and New York, that kind of relates to the strength of the Delta, KLM, Air France, and Virgin joint venture across that market. And it just is a reminder that the regulators are going to continue to look at that. That is not going to go away. And it does feel as though they, on both sides of the Atlantic, there have been kind of statements of intent from the regulators on this.
Yeah, certainly. And it's noteworthy as well that they're kind of supporting JetBlue getting those slots. I know there's a longer backstory to it, as you mentioned, but it's certainly not, there's a perception sometimes that some of the US policies can be quite protectionist. Certainly the European Commission celebrating JetBlue getting slots is just an interesting dynamic there. And I know that partly because some of the European carriers, as you say, are working closely with US carriers in their joint ventures. But it's an interesting one, and it's probably also worth noting, thinking about other markets, that the European Commission and US regulators are the two remaining regulators that still need to rule on Korean Air's acquisition of Asiana. And again, be interesting to see how that plays out. And if they approve that, how will that go down with the European carriers that are trying to get, similar business done within their own, and within the regulator's actual home market. So we're going to get more signs of how they're feeling. You know, it could be the case that these particular cases that have gone through there, that you know, they've got a point, and historically this would have happened before. But you know, I think there is definitely a sense that the way things are going, it's an uphill struggle to get these over the line. And for, you know, carriers that have seen previous consolidation moves, certainly in the US, if you're JetBlue, looking at the size of you know, the big players there, probably feeling slightly aggrieved you've been blocked from taking 8% of the market by buying Spirit, for example. But you know, there obviously things change, and lessons are learned from what's gone before. So yeah, definitely one to watch. And you know, will 2024 be remembered as an inauspicious year for consolidation? Well, it's looking that way so far, is all we can say, I suppose, at this point.
Yeah, we'll definitely be sense checking the mood of those big European carriers in particular, Lufthansa, IAG, Air France, KLM, which of course has its own consolidation moves in process. We'll be looking to see what the mood of the executives there is when they deliver their first quarter or fourth quarter results, actually, I should say, in the coming weeks or so. We, after the break, are going to have a little look at the mood of a couple of carriers who have already reported their results, and we'll do that after this.
Hello listeners, I'm Andy Mason, and I want to introduce you to Beyond Entertainment, a new podcast from Panasonic Avionics. Each week we sit down with the best and brightest in our industry for a quick chat on the future of passenger experience. Everything from display and audio technology to in-flight Wi-Fi and killer digital content to meaningful market research. We're looking at what's now, what's new, and what's next. So join us as we explore the passenger experience. Go Beyond Entertainment. Available now on your favorite podcasting platforms or on our website, panasonic.aero/Beyond Entertainment.
Hello and welcome back. As you said before the break, we've had some of the first airlines to start reporting their end of year results and giving their sort of indications and outlook for the 12 months to come. You know, it's obviously been, you know, a continued year of strong revenues and actually quite a profitable year for airlines as a general rule, particularly the larger airlines. But I think some of the nuances of what to expect, and it is differing from airline to airline, but we have seen a number of quite interesting cases, and we think United Airlines is a particularly interesting carrier because they've been one of the most kind of proactive airlines, I think, since the pandemic. And Lewis, you were on their call. How were they feeling about life?
It was pretty positive, to be honest with you. United at a sort of headline level, there are airlines like United who are seeing, you know, year on year the results aren't quite as strong, so they, you know, profits down a bit, but that's kind of expected. I think there were in 2022 there were still some quite strong kind of post-COVID factors playing into demand levels and the return of capacity, and you know, some of those still exist today clearly, but it was still a slightly unusual year, I think, in 22. So, you know, one theme we're seeing is that some of the really strong figures that certainly the US, which was one of the first markets out of COVID, you know, those kind of figures that they saw in 2022 are slightly unfavourable comparisons now. But I think it's important to look beyond that and first of all acknowledge, as Scott Kirby did, that they talked about this happening essentially, that, you know, there were structural changes in the US market in 23 that he believes are continuing into 24. And I think by and large what he said would happen in 23 did come to pass. As an airline leader in that region, I think he's one of the CEOs who are more comfortable talking about the broad industry in an interesting way. So I think he's worth listening to. And, you know, he did talk about going into 23 how there would be cost pressures that would be higher than experienced before. There would be capacity constraints, whether that is on the staffing side, whether that's on the metal, whether that's at airports, ATC, and, you know, operational issues play into that. So we've seen ATC challenges at several US airports, for example. So it's basically, his idea was that 23 would be a year where capacity would be constrained, and, you know, it's come to pass, really. I mean, most airlines had to moderate their growth projections for the year, and as a result, Kirby would argue that because they saw this coming, that they reacted to it, and it wasn't a surprise to them, and as a result, there's more of the same in 24, and they're sort of ready for it essentially. So broadly, that's where he says they are. I mean, as I say, if you just concentrate on the cold hard figures we've seen, the headline would be United's profit down, but kind of to be expected. Costs are higher. There's been a bit of moderation in some yields. So he's pretty positive, and on the competitive side particularly, actually.
I think you're still seeing within that US market that pressure within probably in the low cost segment, which we've talked about a bit over recent times. Transatlantic, I think there'll still be, United has expanded quite strongly there over the period. This will probably be more of a consolidation period for them for this year. But, those markets will remain, everything suggests that the demand picture is still relatively strong and the aircraft supply shortage is into that. But, there is a cost factor. And, of course, those costs remain a challenge. And we've seen concerns around oil prices, still concerns, obviously, around labour costs and so forth. So, none of this is going away. And, I suspect we might be in for not necessarily a bumpy year, but a year of continued uncertainty when you look at the kind of unprecedented number of elections that we have happening across the year. Obviously, the US one is a particular one of focus towards the back end of the year, but there are, a kind of unprecedented amount of elections happening this year, which just adds that additional level of uncertainty. And I think it might take a while for, not that we'll see a conflicted message from people, but, I think it is going to be difficult to fully work out what the environment is going to be for the year ahead.
It is, yeah, and I think on the cost side particularly, that is one to keep an eye on. Obviously, it's been a bit up and down. You mentioned fuel. Yeah, we know that in some ways there's been a bit of better news on that than maybe expected, particularly when the conflict broke out in the Middle East. But one of Kirby's key points was that he talks about cost convergence, and sort of his view, what he means by that is between a network carrier like his and the low-cost carriers, they're all facing rising costs, but they're rising more steeply among the low-cost carriers. Now, that's having the impact that fares are going up. So, while United is also having higher costs, it's not like the low-cost carriers are massively able to undercut United. So, essentially, those fares on what some would view as commoditized short-haul markets are being pushed up because the low-cost carriers are more steeply affected by these rising costs than the network players. And that means that what Kirby talks about, the cost passing through to revenue and fares, is happening, as I guess, again, as he said he had predicted they would. So, in his view, the environment is better for the network carriers at the moment than it is for the low-cost players because of that. I guess a higher proportion of like paying pilots a lot more, for example. I think a lot of the low-cost carriers have had to, because of the tightness of the recruitment market for pilots, for example, are suddenly having to pay a lot more than they had in the past. So, there's a bit of catch-up there, and because of the tightness in the market, as I say, it's become critical that they do that, and that means that their costs are going up quickly. So, that's one of Kirby's points. And I think to an extent we can see that in some of the quarterly reporting. We know that a lot of those low-cost players who pretty heavily domestic market focused in many cases had an excellent 2022 in terms of, certainly from the summer onwards, in terms of their quarterly financial performance, but it has not been quite so rosy sort of towards the end of 23. And so, an interesting dynamic in that market. He's talked about it before, but he reiterates again that he thinks that's going to be a thing to watch.
And in Europe, interestingly, we haven't, the big network carriers are still to report, but we have heard from a couple of significant low-cost carriers, and two of the ones have really been trying to expand rapidly since the pandemic, and for different kind of industry reasons that haven't found it straightforward, in the form of Ryanair and Wizz.
Yeah, again, so Ryanair is sort of a bit of a out. I think in Europe, certainly, it really towards the end of 22, obviously it prided itself COVID crisis, saying it was ready to go. Basically, it didn't do any big layoffs. It was kind of ready to start when demand came back. So it really benefited at the end of 22 from some pretty strong financials in that last quarter. Reporting the last quarter of 23, therefore, they're probably not. It's not quite a strong year on year. And it's seasonally weak as well. But generally, they were pretty positive about the progress they're making in the current fiscal year, sort of ending March and looking into 24. Probably the most interesting thing I think Ryanair came out with was talking about how they believe that as a whole, European short-haul capacity will be down this summer, year on year, which, given that it's not caught up with 2019 levels yet, is a fairly significant development. And I think Michael O'Leary went as far as suggesting that could continue, into 2025 and possibly beyond. Now, there's obviously always a degree of self-interest in some of these projections, but it's certainly given the capacity pressure that airlines are facing, and not least Ryanair. I mean, Ryanair expects to grow, expects its capacity to be up 9% this summer. Not as much as it had hoped, because it's a 737 MAX customer. It's getting them, but not at the rate that it wanted. So it's going to be, I think, 7 or 8 aircraft down for the summer, according to its current thinking. I think that was before the most recent MAX issue came to pass, but I'm not sure if Ryanair are affected by that. So their kind of projection is that European short capacity is probably 92-93% of pre-COVID levels this summer, which is a couple of percentage points down on where it was in the 23. And there is reason to believe that, and I think that's where Wizz Air come into the picture particularly.
Yeah, I mean, I think Wizz Air is interesting because if Ryanair finds itself, if not directly, very much, perhaps indirectly, feeling the impact of the challenges Boeing is having in terms of delivering the MAX aircraft, Wizz Air's challenges are actually talk to some of the other challenges in this affecting capacity at the moment, and namely the GTF engine issue, which is impacting several airlines around the world to differing levels, and that could be a factor for a while yet. And those particular issues are in the Middle East.
Yeah, so Wizz basically didn't have the best last 3 months of the year. I think while it was still growing its capacity at that point, financially it wasn't the best set of results. But like you say, I think it's if you wanted to pick an airline that is most exposed to the impact of the Israel-Hamas war on airlines, aside from the ones that are directly in that region, and B, on the aircraft availability side of things, I think you'd pull out Wizz Air. I mean, on the Israel services, I think it said it had to reassign about 9% of its capacity as a result of that during the quarter. I think it took it didn't detail what that financial hit was. I think EasyJet was about, a £40 million hit from having to cancel some of its services in the region, but Wizz didn't specify an amount, but certainly said it took a while, obviously, to sort out where it was reassigning its aircraft, and there was a financial impact from having to do so. So a relatively large proportion of its capacity compared with a lot of other carriers was into that region. So a lot to do there, and that had an impact. I think it's going to restart services to Tel Aviv on the 1st of March, and we've actually seen over the past few weeks more and more carriers doing that. So it feels like there's a degree, if there's clearly not normalisation as things stand in terms of the conflict, but certainly in terms of airline services, more and more carriers are going back in there. Clearly not at a level that they would have been offering pre-October last year, but clearly the Pratt & Whitney engine issue is. So Joseph Varadi, the Wizz Air CEO, was saying that by the end of March they expect to have 40 aircraft on the ground as a result of that. At the same time, the fleet is around 200 aircraft, so you can see that's a really big proportion of the airline's fleet. The impact of that, it still thinks it will achieve full year growth for the current fiscal year, which ends 31st of March. But looking into the next fiscal year, it's saying it will be flat in growth terms, which for an airline like Wizz Air, particularly how it was talking during the pandemic, this was its moment. I think this is our moment, I think, was the words that Varadi might have used. They saw that opportunity to grow and quickly into new markets, and to be having a year off growth is quite a significant development. And going back to Ryanair's projection for short capacity, clearly flat growth doesn't mean dropping capacity, but it is contributing to that potential trend, I think, coming this year. So Wizz, very keen to stress the fundamentals are still there for them. They'll say they've got low costs compared with competitors. Ryanair will tell you theirs are even lower, but we'll leave them to that. And so Varadi was keen to stress that there might be a pause in growth, and it's achieving flat growth while having that level of of its fleet grounded, partly through the fact it is taking new aircraft still. It's extending the leases of some of its older jets. It's taking short-term capacity on. These things aren't cheap, but equally it is being compensated for the fleet grounding. So there's certainly going to be a pause. So it will be a really interesting year, I think, in the European short-haul capacity. As you say, we're yet to hear from the big airline groups who report towards the end of February and into March, but it's quite amazing, really, that we're already talking about potential moderation of capacity after 3 years of everyone being absolutely desperate to pile back into markets, and it's not quite worked out as maybe everyone expected.
No, it's the pathway back has been, everything increased, and demand was stronger than anyone ever anticipated. But getting over these last kind of latter stages of it are proving, much harder to do than perhaps have been thought, and that's before we kind of consider other parts of the world where, Asia still has a long way to go. So, it was still at a top level when you look at those other parts of the industry which still have to build back. Asia, I'm sure we'll see capacity returning strongly there, but I think it is going to be more of a mixed picture than we've probably seen. Not a one size fits all, because some airlines are more exposed to particular issues than others. I think the supply chain and the aircraft shortage issue and the cost issues, all of those are impacting everybody. That nobody escapes that. But there are some who have specific fleet challenges, and there's some that have particular market challenges, and that's often the case. But that feels like it's definitely the case this year and for the summer ahead.
It does, and of course, as we've talked about before, these capacity challenges do have an upside, which is that you've got higher costs, but my word, you've also got higher yields, and there's a bit of demand moderation maybe we've seen in the US, but equally the US is one of the few markets where they're already trending above pre-COVID traffic levels, whereas Europe's got a bit of a way to go to get there, and it just means that we lost 4 years of growth in Europe and across the world in the industry, really. But even accounting for that, demand is very strong, and I think I've been a bit surprised by how we haven't yet seen many carriers really suggest that trend is moderating to any great extent. I think everyone stopped talking about pent up demand coming out of COVID and maybe started to get a bit more comfortable with there being quite structurally strong demand for air travel. And to be fair, when you factor in the fact that there would be probably 10-15% more capacity in the market potentially if we hadn't had the pandemic, then it does sort of start to stack up. Obviously, the economics catch up with you one day, but at the moment, if you've got aircraft and you're an incumbent in a market, you are doing all right yield wise, and it's a headache not having that capacity, and it is. From a strategic point of view, it's frustrating because the opportunities coming out of COVID were there, as I say, particularly in Wizz Air's case. They really sold themselves on being the ones to back coming out of COVID. So I'm sure that they're not going to be behind the scenes, won't be delighted that they've got 40 A320neo family aircraft sitting on the ground. But equally, that's in a market where people are paying quite a lot to travel and seem to be continuing to do so. Yeah, so it's not all bad. I guess that's the lesson.
Yeah. So slightly inauspicious as ever. I think we always say this. It's probably too early to tell what the full mood is like. Lots of uncertainties, but we will keep watching. Lewis, thanks for your time this week.
Thank you, Graham.
This week, I should say this month. We'll be back at the start of March with our next Airline Business Podcast. Thanks to Panasonic Avionics for sponsoring the podcast. Do give the Beyond Entertainment podcast a listen. A reminder, you can catch up on all the news and stories we've mentioned in this podcast at FlightGlobal.com. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please like and review us. Don't forget to subscribe to get new episodes in your podcast feeds directly, and we'll see you again next time.